Chapter 40. Elizabeth's impatience to acquaint Jane with what had happened could no longer be overcome, and at length, resolving to suppress every particular in which her sister was concerned, preparing her to be surprised, she related to her the next morning the chief of the scene between Mr. Darcy and herself. Mrs. Bennet's astonishment was soon lessened by the strong sisterly particularity which made any admiration of Elizabeth appear perfectly natural, and all surprise was shortly lost in other feelings. She was worried that Mr. Darcy should have delivered his sentiments in a manner so suited to recommend them, but still more she was grieved for the unhappiness which her sister's refusal must have given him. His being so sure of succeeding was wrong, she said, and certainly ought not to have appeared. But consider how it must have increased his disappointment. Indeed, replied Elizabeth, I am heartily sorry for him, but he has other feelings, which will probably soon drive away his regard for me. You do not blame me, however, for refusing him. Blame you? Oh, no. But you do blame me for having spoken so warmly of Wickham. No, I do not know that you were wrong in saying what you did. She then spoke of the letter, repeating the whole of its contents as far as they concerned George Wickham. What a stroke was this for poor Jane, who would willingly have gone through the world without believing that so much wickedness existed in the whole race of mankind as were here collected in one individual. Nor was Darcy's vindication, though grateful to her feelings, capable of consoling her for such discovery. Most earnestly she did labor to prove the probability of error, and to seek clear the one without involving the other. This will not do, said Elizabeth. You never will make both of them good for anything. Take your choice, but you must be satisfied with only one. There is but a quantity of merit between them, just enough to make one good sort of man, and of it late has been shifting pretty much. For my part, I am inclined to believe it all Darcy's, but you should do as you choose. It was some time, however, before a smile could be extorted from Jane. I do not know when I have been more shocked, she said. Wickham, so very bad. It is almost past belief. And poor Mr. Darcy. Dear Lizzie, only consider what he must have suffered. Such a disappointment, and with the knowledge of your ill opinion, too, and having to relate such a thing of his sister. It really too distressing. I am sure you feel it so. Oh, no, my regret and compassion are all done away by seeing you so full of both. I know you will do him such ample justice that I am growing every moment more unconcerned and indifferent. Your profusion makes me saving, and if you lament over him much longer, my heart will be as light as a feather. Poor Wickham. There is such expression of goodness in his countenance, such an openness and gentleness in his manner. Lizzie, when you first read that letter, I'm sure you could not treat the matter as you do now. Indeed, I could not. I was uncomfortable enough, and I may say unhappy, but with no one to speak to about what I felt, no Jane to comfort me and say that I had not been so very weak and vain and nonsensical as I knew I had. Oh, how I wanted you. How unfortunate that you should have used such a strong expressions in speaking of Mr. Wickham to Darcy, for now they do appear hopefully undeserved. Certainly, but the fortune of speaking bitterness is a most natural consequence of the prejudice I had been encouraging. There is one point on which I want your advice. I want to be told whether or not to make our acquaintances in general understand Wickham's character. Miss Bennet paused a little and then replied, Surely there can be no occasion for exposing him so dreadfully. What is your opinion? That it ought not to be attempted. Mr. Darcy has not authorized me to make his communication public. On the contrary, every particular relative to his sister was meant to be kept as much as possible to myself, If I endure to undeceive people as to the rest of his conduct, who will believe me? The general prejudice against Mr. Darcy so violent that it would be the death of half the good people in Merrington to attempt to place him in amicable light. I am not equal to it. Wickham will soon be gone, and therefore it will not signify to anyone what he really is. Sometime hence it will all be found out, and then we may laugh at their stupidity in not knowing it before. At present, I will not say anything about it. You are quite right. To have his errors made public might ruin him forever. He is now perhaps sorry for what he has done and anxious to re-establish a character. We must not make him desperate. The tumult of Elizabeth's mind was allayed by this conversation. She had got rid of 2 of the secrets which had weighed on her for a fortnight, and was certain of a willing listener in Jane, whenever again she wished to talk of either. But there was still something lurking behind, of which prudence forbade the disclosure. She dared not relate the other half of Mr. Darcy's letter, nor explain to her sister how sincerely she had been valued by her friend. Here was knowledge in which no one could partake, and she was sensible that nothing less than the perfect understanding between the parties could justify her in throwing off this last encumbrance of mystery. And then, she said, it is very improbable event should ever take place. I shall merely be able to tell what Bingley may tell in a much more agreeable manner himself. The liberty of communication cannot be mine till it is lost all its value. She was now, on being settled at home, at the leisure to observe the real state of her sister's spirits. Jane was not happy. She still cherished a very tender affection for Bingley. Having never even fancied herself in love before, her regard had all the warmth of first attachment, and from her age and disposition, greater steadiness than the first attachment often boasts. And so fervent did she value his remembrance and prefer him to every other man, that all her good sense and all her attention to feelings of her friends were required to check in the indulgence of those regrets which might have been injurious to her own health and their tranquillity. Well, Lizzie, said Miss Bennet one day, what is your opinion now of this sad business of Jane's? For my part, I am determined never to speak of it again to anybody. I told my sister Phelps so the other day, but I cannot find out that Jane saw anything of him in London. Well, he's a very undeserving young man, and I do not suppose there is the least chance in the world of her ever getting to know him now. There is no talk of his coming to Netherfield again in the summer, and I have inquired of everyone, too, who is likely to know. I do not believe he will ever live at Netherfield any more. Oh, well, it is as he chooses. Nobody wants him to come. Though I shall always say he used my daughter extremely ill. If I was her, I would not have put up with it. Well, my comfort is, I am sure Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he will be sorry for what he has done. But as Elizabeth could not receive comfort from any such expectation, she made no answer. Well, Lizzie, continued her mother so soon afterwards, and so the Collinses live very comfortable, do they? Well, I only hope it will last. What sort of table do they keep? Charlotte is an excellent manager, I dare say. If she is half as sharp as her mother, she is saving enough. There is nothing extravagant in their housekeeping, I dare say. No, nothing at all. A great deal of good management depends on it. Yes, they will take care not to outrun their income. They never will be distressed for money. Well, much good may it do them. And so, I suppose, they often talk of having a Lomburn when your father is dead. They look upon it as quite their own, I dare say, whenever that happens. It was a subject which they could not mention before me. No, it would have been strange if they had, but I make no doubt they often talk of it between themselves. Well, if they can be easy with an estate that is not lawfully their own, so much the better. I should be ashamed of only having one that was entailed on me. Chapter 41. The first week of the return was soon gone. The second began. It was the last of the regiment's stay in Merrington, and all the young ladies in the neighborhood were drooping apace. The dejection was almost universal. The elder Miss Bennets alone were still able to eat, drink, and sleep and pursue the usual course of their employments. Very frequently, they were reproached for this insensibility by Kitty and Lydia, whose own misery was extreme and who could not comprehend such hard-heartedness in any of the family. "Good heaven, what is to become of us? What are we to do?" they would often exclaim in the bitterness of woe. "How can you be so smiling, Lizzie?" Their affectionate mother shared all their grief. She remembered that she had herself endured on a similar occasion 25 years ago. "I am sure," she said, "I cried for 2 days when Colonel Milner's regiment went away. I thought I should have broken my heart." "I am sure I shall break mine," said Lydia. "Oh, yes, if one could go to Brighton, but Papa is so disagreeable. A little sea bathing would set me up forever." Such were the kind of lamentations resounding perpetually through Longbourn House. Elizabeth tried to be diverted by them, but all sense of pleasure was lost in shame. She felt anew the justice of Mr. Darcy's objections, and never had she been so disposed to pardon his interference in the view of his friend. But the gloom of Lydia's prospect was shortly cleared away, for she received an invitation from Mrs. Foster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to accompany her to Brighton. This valuable friend was a very young woman and very lately married. A resemblance in good humor and good spirits had recommended her and Lydia to each other, and out of their 3 months' acquaintanceship, they had been intimate too. The rapture of Lydia on this occasion, her admiration of Mrs. Foster, and the delight of Miss Bennet, and the mortification of Kitty are scarcely to be described. Wholly inactive to her sister's feelings, Lydia flew about the house in reckless ecstasy, calling for everyone's congratulations and laughing and talking with more violence than ever, whilst the luckless Kitty continued in the parlor, repined at her fate in terms as unreasonable as her accent was peevish. "I cannot see why Miss Foster should not ask me as well as Lydia," she said, "though I am not her particular friend. I have just as much right to be asked as she has, and more so too, for I am 2 years older." In vain did Elizabeth attempt to make her reasonable, and Jane to make her resigned. As for Elizabeth herself, this invitation was so far from exciting in her the same feelings as in her mother and Lydia, that she considered it the death warrant of all possible of common sense for the latter. And detestable as such a step must make on her were it known, she could not help secretly advising her father not to let her go. She represented to him all the importances of Lydia's general behavior, the little advantage she could derive from the friendship of such a woman as Mrs. Foster, and the probability of her being yet more imprudent with such a companion at Brighton, where the temptations must be greater than at home. He heard her attentively and then said, "Lydia will never be easy until she has exposed herself in some public place or another. And we can never expect her to do it without so little expense or inconvenience to her family as under the present circumstances." "If you were aware," said Elizabeth, "of the very great disadvantage to us all which might arise from the public notice of Lydia's unguarded and imprudent manner, nay, which has already arisen from it, I am sure you would judge differently in the affair." "Already arisen?" repeated Mr. Bennet. "What, has she frightened away some of your lovers?" Poor little Lizzie. But do not be cast down. Such squeamish youths as cannot bear to be connected with a little absurdity are not worth a regret. Come, let me see the list of pitiable fellows who have been kept aloof by Lydia's folly. Indeed, you are mistaken. I have no such injuries to resent. It is not of peculiar, but of general evils which I am now complaining. Our importance, our respectability in the world must be affected by wild velocity, the assurance and disdain of all resent which mark Lydia's character. excuse me, for I must speak plainly. If you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits and of teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of her life, her character will be fixed, and she will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that has ever made herself or the family ridiculous. A flirt, too, in the worst and meanest degree of flirtation, without any attraction beyond youth in a tolerable person, and from the ignorance and emptiness of her mind, wholly unable to ward off any portion of that universal contempt which her rage for admiration will excite. In this danger, Kitty also is comprehended. She will follow wherever Lydia leads, vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled. My dear father, can you suppose it possible that they will not be censured and despised wherever they are known, and that their sisters will not be often involved in the disgrace? Mr. Bennet saw that her whole heart was in the subject, and affectionately taking her hand, said in reply, "Do not make yourself uneasy, my love. Wherever you and Jane are known, you must be respected and valued, and you will not appear to be less advantaged for having a couple of, or may I say 3, very silly sisters. We shall have no peace at Longbourn if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Let her go, then. Colonel Foster is a sensible man, and will keep her out of any real mischief. And she is luckily too poor to be an object of prey to anybody. At Brighton she will be of less importance even as a common flirt than she has been here. The officers will find a woman better worth their notice. Let us hope, therefore, that her being there may teach her her own insignificance. At any rate, she cannot grow many degrees worse, without authorizing us to lock her up for the rest of her life." With this answer, Elizabeth was forced to be content, but her own opinion continued the same, and she left him disappointed and sorry. It was not in her nature, however, to increase her vexations by dwelling on them. She was confident of having performed her duty, and to fret over unavoidable evils or augment them by anxiety was no part of her disposition. Had Lydia and her mother known the substance of her conference with their father, their indignation would hardly have found expression in their united volubility. In Lydia's imagination, a visit to Brighton comprised of every possibility of earthly happiness. She saw, with the creative eye of fancy, the streets of that gay bathing place covered with officers. She saw herself the object of attention to tens and scores of them at present unknown. She saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauticious uniformity of lines, crowded with the young men and the gay, the dazzling with the scarlet, and, to compete with the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. Had she known her sister sought to tear her from such prospects and such realities as these, what would have been her sensations? They could have been understood only by her mother, who might have felt nearly the same. Lydia's going to Brighton was all that consoled her for the melancholy conviction of her husband never intending to go there himself. But they were entirely ignorant of what had passed, and their raptures continued with little intermission to the very day of Lydia's leaving home. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time, having been frequently in company with him since her return. Agitation was pretty well over, the agitations of formal partiality entirely so. She had learnt to detect, even in the greatness of which had first delighted her, an affection and a sameness to disgust and weary. In his present behavior to herself, moreover, she had a fresh source of displeasure, for the inclination he soon testified of renewing those intentions which had marked the early part of their acquaintanceship could only severe, after what had passed, to provoke her. She lost all concern from him in finding herself thus as the object of such idle and frivolous gallantry, and while she steadily repressed it, could not feel but the reproof contained in his believing that however long and for whatever cause his attentions had been withdrawn, her vanity would be gratified, and her preference secured at any time by their renewal. On the very last day of the regiment remaining at Merrington, he dined with the other officers at Longbourn, and so little was Elizabeth disposed to part from him in good humor that on his making some inquiry as to the manner in which her time had passed at Hunsford, she mentioned Colonel Fitzpatrick and Mr. Darcy having both spent 3 weeks at Rosings, and asked him if he was acquainted with the former. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but with a moment's recollection and returning a smile, replied that he had formerly seen him often, and after observing that he was a very gentlemanlike man, asked her how she had liked him. Her answer was warmly in her favor. With an air of indifference, he soon afterwards added, "How long ago did you say he was at Rosings?" "Nearly 3 weeks." "And you saw him frequently?" "Yes, almost every day." "His manners are very different from his cousin's." "Yes, very different. But I think Mr. Darcy improves upon acquaintance." "Indeed," cried Mr. Wickham, with the look which did not escape her. "And pray, may I ask," but checking himself, he added in a gayer tone, "is it in address that he improves? He has not deigned to add aught of civility to his ordinary style, for I dare not hope," he continued in a lower, more serious tone, "that he is improved in the essentials." "Oh, no," cried Elizabeth. "In the essentials, I believe, he is very much whatever he was." While she spoke, Wickham looked as scarcely knowing whether to rejoice over her words or to distrust their meaning. There was something in her countenance that made him listen with an apprehensive and anxious attention, while she added, "When I say that he improved on acquaintance, I did not mean that his mind or his manners were in a state of improvement, but that, knowing him better, his disposition was better understood." Wickham's alarm now appeared in a heightened complexion and agitated look. For a few minutes he was silent, till shaking off his embarrassment, he turned to her again and said in the gentlest of accents, "You, who so well know my feelings towards Mr. Darcy, I will readily comprehend how sincerely I must rejoice that he is wise enough to assume even the appearance of what is right. His pride in that direction may be of service, if not to himself, to many others, for it must only deter him from such fool misconceptions as I have suffered by. I only fear that the sort of cautiousness to which you, I imagine, have been alluding is merely adopted on his visits to his aunt, of whose good opinion and judgment he stands much in awe. His fear of her has always operated, I know, when they were together, and a good deal is to be impugned on his wish of forwarding the match with Miss Burr, which I am certain he has very much at heart." Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this, but she answered only by a slight inclination of her head. She saw that he wanted to engage her on the subject of his grievances, and she was in no humor to indulge him. The rest of the evening passed with the appearance, on his side, of useful cheerfulness, but with no further attempt to distinguish Elizabeth. They parted at last with mutual civility, and possibly a mutual desire of never meeting again. When the party broke up, Lydia returned with Mrs. Foster to Merrington, from which they were to set out the next morning. The separation between her family was rather noisy than pathetic. Kitty was the only one who shed tears, but she did weep from vexation and envy. Miss Bennet was diffused in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter, and impressive in her injunctions that she could not miss the opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible, advice which there was every reason to believe would be well attended to. And in the clamorous happiness of Lydia herself in bidding farewell, the more gentle adieus of her sisters were uttered without being heard. Chapter 42. Had Elizabeth's opinion been all drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing opinion of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, that the appearance of good humor which youth and beauty were generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennet was not of a disposition to seek comfort for the disappointment which his own imprudence had brought on, and any of those pleasures which too often console the unfortunate for their folly of their vice. He was fond of country and of books, and from this taste had arisen his principal enjoyments. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted, that her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would in general wish to owe his wife, but where there are other powers of entertainment or waning, the true philosopher will derive benefit from such as are given. Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behavior as a husband. She had always seen it with plain, but respecting his abilities. And grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endured to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts the continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum which, in exposing his wife to the contempt for her own children, was highly reprehensible. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attest to the children of so unsuitable a marriage, nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from the ill-judged direction of talents which, used rightly, might at least have preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. When Elizabeth had rejoiced over Wickham's departure, she found little other cause for satisfaction in the loss of the regiment. Their parties abroad were less varied than before, and at home she had a mother and sister who were constantly repining over the dullness of everything around them through a real gloom over their domestic circle. And though Kitty might find in time regain her natural degree of sense, since the distributors of her brain were removed, her other sister, from whose disposition greater evil might be apprehended, was likely to be hardened in all of her folly and assurance by a situation of such a double danger as a watering place in a camp. Upon the whole, therefore, she found what has been sometimes been found before, that an event to which she had been looking with impatient desire did not, in taking place, bring all the satisfaction she had promised herself. It was consequently necessary to name some other period for the commencement of actual felicity, to have some other point on which her wishes and hopes might be fixed, and by again enjoying the pleasures of anticipation, console herself for the present and prepare for another disappointment. Her tour to the lakes was now the object of her happiest thoughts. It was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which the discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable. She could have included Jane in that scheme. Every part of it would have been perfect. But it is unfortunate, she thought, that I have something to wish for the whole arrangement complete, my disappointment would be certain. But here, by carrying with me one ceaseless source of regret in my sister's absence, I may reasonably hope to have all my expectations of pleasure realized. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful, and great disappointment is only warded off by the defense of some little peculiar vexation. When Lydia went away, she promised to write very often and very minutely to her mother and Kitty. But her letters were always long expected and were always very short. Those to her mother contained little else than that they were just returned from the library, where such and such officers had attended them, and where she had seen such beautiful ordnance as made her quite wild, that she had a new gown or a new parcel, which she would have described more fully, but was obliged to leave off in a violent hurry, as Mrs. Foster called her, and they were going off to camp, and from her correspondence with her sister, there was still less to be learnt. from her letters to Kitty, though rather longer, were much too full of lines under words to be made public. After the first fortnight or 3 weeks of her absence, health, good humor, and cheerfulness began to reappear at Longbourn. Everything wore a happier aspect. The families who had been in town for the winter came back again, and the summer finery and summer engagements arose. Miss Bennet was restored to her usual quillinous serenity, and by the middle of June, Kitty was so much recovered as to be able to enter Merrington without tears, an event of such happy promise to make Elizabeth hope that by the following Christmas she might be so tolerably reasonable as to not mention an officer above once a day, unless by some cruel and malicious arrangement at the War Office another regiment should be quartered in Merrington. The time fixed for the beginning of their northern tour was now fast approaching, and on a fortnight only was wanting of it when a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner, which at once delayed its commencement and curtailed its extent. Mr. Gardiner would have prevented by business from settling out till a fortnight later in July, and must be in London again within a month. And as for that, left too short of a period for them to go so far and see so much as they had proposed, or at least to see it with the pleasure and comfort they had built upon. They were obliged to give up the lakes and substitute a more contracted tour, and, according to the present plan, were to go no further northwards than Derbyshire. In that country there was enough to be seen to occupy the chief of their 3 weeks. And to Mrs. Gardiner it had been particularly strong attraction. Town where she had formerly passed some years of her life, and where they were now to spend a few days, was probably as great an object of her curiosity as all the celebrated beauties of Matlock, Chatsworth, Dovetail, or the Peak. Elizabeth was exceedingly disappointed, and she had set in her heart seeing the lakes, and still thought there might have been time enough. But it was her business to be satisfied, and certainly her temper to be happy, and all soon was right again. With the mention of Derbyshire there were many ideas connected. It was impossible for her to see the world without thinking of Pemberley and its owner. But surely, she said, I may enter his country without impunity, and rob it of a few petrified spars without his receiving me. The time of expectation was now doubled. 4 weeks were to pass before her uncle and aunt's arrival, but they did not pass away, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, did at length appear at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls at the 6 and 8 years old, and 2 younger boys, were left under the particular cares of their cousin Jane, who was the general favorite, and whose steady sense and sweetness of temper exactly adapted her for attending to them in every way, teaching them, playing with them, and loving them. The Gardiner stayed only one night at Longbourn, and set off the next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of novelty and amusement. One enjoyment was certain, that their suitableness of companionship, and a suitableness which comprehended health and temper to bear inconveniences, cheerfulness to enhance every pleasure, and affection and intelligence, which might supply it among themselves if they were disappointed abroad. It is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor any of the remarkable places through which their route lay, Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, Birmingham, etc., they are sufficiently known. A small part of Derbyshire is all the present concern. To the little town of Lambton, the scene of Mrs. Gardiner's former residence, and where she had lately learned some acquaintance still remained. They bent their steps, after having seen all the principal wonders of the country, and within 5 miles of Lambton, Elizabeth found from her aunt that Pemberley was situated. It was not in their direct road, nor more than a mile or 2 out of it. In talking over their route the evening before, Mr. Gardiner expressed an inclination to see the place again. Mr. Gardiner declared his willingness, and Elizabeth was applied to for her approbation. My love, should you not like to see a place of which you have heard so much, said her aunt, a place, too, with so many of your acquaintances are connected. Wickham passed all of his youth there, you know. Elizabeth was distressed. She felt she had no business at Pemberley, and was obliged to assume a disinclination for seeing it. She must own that she was tired of seeing great houses. After going over so many, she really had no pleasure in fine carpets or satin curtains. Miss Gardiner abused her stupidity. If it were merely a fine house, richly furnished, she said, I should not care about it myself, but the grounds are delightful. They have some of the finest woods in the country. Elizabeth said no more, but her mind could not acquiesce. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy while viewing the place instantly occupied. It would be dreadful. She blushed at the very idea and thought it would be better to speak openly to her aunt than to run such a risk. But against this there were objections, and she finally resolved that it could be the last resource if her private inquiries to the absence of the family were unfavorably answered. Accordingly, when she retired at night, she asked the chambermaid whether Pemberley were not a fine place. What was the name of its proprietor? And, with no little alarm, whether the family was down for the summer. A most welcome negative followed the last question, and her alarms now being removed, she was at leisure to feel a great deal of curiosity to see the house herself, and when the subject was revived the next morning, she was again applied to, could readily answer, and with a proper air of indifference, that she had not really any dislike to the scheme. To Pemberley, therefore, they were to go. Chapter 43. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation, and when at length they turned in at the lodge, her spirits were in high flutter. The park was very large, and contained great variety of ground. They entered it in one of its lowest points, and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot in point of view. They gradually ascended for half a mile, and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high, rolling hills, and in front a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor forcefully adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where more natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be the mistress of Pemberley might be something. They ascended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the door. And, while examining the nearer aspect of the house, all of her appreciation of meeting its owner returned. She dreaded lest the chambermaid had been mistaken. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into the hall, and Elizabeth, as they waited for the housekeeper, had leisure to wonder at her being where she was. The housekeeper came, a respectable, older-looking elderly woman, much less fine and more civil than she had any notion of finding her. They followed her into the dining parlor. It was large, well-proportioned room, handsomely fitted up. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to a window to enjoy its prospect. The hill, crowned with wood, which they had descended, receiving increased abruptness from the distance, was a beautiful object. Every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene, the river, the trees scattered on the banks of the winding of the valley as far as she could trace it, with delight. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taking different positions, but from every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable to the fortune of its proprietor. But Elizabeth saw, with the admiration of his taste, that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less of splendor and more real elegance than the furniture of Rosings. And of this place, she thought, I might have been mistress. With these rooms I might now have been familiarly acquainted. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have rejoiced in them as my own and welcomed them as my visitors, my uncle and aunt. But no, recollecting herself, that could never be. My uncle and aunt would have been lost to me. I should not have been allowed to invite them. This was a lucky recollection. It saved her from something very like regret. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master was really absent, but had not the courage for it. At length, however, the question was asked by her uncle, and she turned away with alarm, while Miss Reynolds replied that he was, adding, "But we expect him tomorrow with a large party of friends." How rejoiced was Elizabeth that their journey had not by any circumstance been delayed a day. Her aunt now called her to look at the picture. She approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham, suspended among several other miniatures over the mantelpiece. Her aunt asked her, smiling, how she liked it. The housekeeper came forward and told them it was a picture of a young gentleman, the son of her late master Stuart, who had been brought up by him at his own expense. He is now gone into the army, she added, but I am afraid he has turned out very wild. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. And that, said Miss Reynolds, pointing to another of the miniatures, is my master, and very much like him. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago. I have heard much of your master's fine person, said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. It is a handsome face. But, Lizzie, you can tell us whether it is or not. Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on this information of her knowing her master. Does a young lady know Mr. Darcy? Elizabeth colored and said, a little. And do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, madam? Yes, very handsome. I am sure none so handsome, but in the gallery upstairs you will see a finer, larger picture of him than this. This room was my late master's favorite room, and these miniatures are just as they used to be then. He was very fond of them. This accounted to Elizabeth for Mr. Wickham's being among them. Mrs. Reynolds then directed their attention to one of Mrs. Darcy's, drawn where she was only 8 years old. And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother? Said Mrs. Gardiner. Oh, yes, the handsomest young lady that has ever was seen, and so accomplished. She plays and sings all day. In the next room is a new instrument just come down for her, a present from my master. She comes here tomorrow with him. Mr. Gardiner, whose manners were very easy and pleasant, encouraged her communicativeness by his questions and remarks. Mrs. Reynolds, either by pride or attachment, had evidently great pleasure in talking of her master and his sister. Is your master much at Pemberley in the course of the year? Not so much as I wish, sir, but I dare say he may spend half his time here, and Miss Darcy is always down for the summer months. Except, thought Elizabeth, when she goes to Ramsgate. If your master would marry, you might see more of him. Yes, sir, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth could not help saying, it is very much to his credit, I am sure, that you would think so. I say no more than the truth, and everybody will say that knows him, replied the other. Elizabeth thought this was going pretty far, and she listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, I have never known a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old. This was praise, of all others most extraordinary and most opposite to her ideas. That he was not a good-tempered man had been in her firmest opinion. Her keenest attention was awakened, and she longed to hear more and was grateful to her uncle for saying, there are very few people of whom so much can be said. You are lucky in having such a master. Yes, sir, I know I am. If I were to go through the world, I could not meet with a better. But I have always observed that they who are good-natured when children are good-natured when they grow up, and he has always been the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world. Elizabeth almost stared at her. Can this be Mr. Darcy? Thought she. His father was an excellent man, said Miss Gardiner. Yes, madam, that he was indeed, and his son will be just like him, just as affable to the poor. Elizabeth listened, wondered, doubted, and was impatient for more. Mrs. Reynolds could interest her on no other point. She related the subjects of the pictures, the dimensions of the rooms, and the price of the furniture in vain. Mr. Gardiner, highly amused by the kind of family prejudice to which he attributed her excessive commendation of her master, soon led again to the subject. And she dwelt with energy on his many merits, as they proceeded together up the great staircase. He is the best landlord and the best master, she said, that has ever lived, not like the wild young men nowadays who think nothing but themselves. There is no one of his tenants or servants but will give him a good name. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men. In what amicable light does this place hold him? Thought Elizabeth. This fine account of him, whispered her aunt as they walked, is not quite consistent with his behavior to our poor friend. Perhaps we might be deceived. That is not very likely. Our authority was too good. On reaching the spacious lobby above, they were shown into a very pretty sitting room, lately fitted up with a greater elegance and lightness than the apartments below, and were informed that it was but just done to give the pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had taken a liking to the room when last at Pemberley. He certainly is a good brother, said Elizabeth, as she walked in towards one of the windows. Mrs. Reynolds anticipated Miss Darcy's delight when she should enter the room, and this is always the way with him, she added. Wherever he can give his sister any pleasure is sure to be done in a moment. There is nothing he would not do for her. The picture gallery, in 2 or 3 of the principal bedrooms, were all that remained to be shown. In the former were many good paintings, but Elizabeth knew nothing of the art, and from such as had already visible below, she had willingly turned to look at some drawings of Miss Darcy's in crayons, whose subjects were unusually more interesting and also more intelligible. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could have been little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance to Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture in earnest contemplation, and returned to it again before they quitted the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that it had been taken during his father's lifetime. There was certainty at this moment, in Elizabeth's mind, a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt at the height of their acquaintance. The accommodation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, as a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship. How much of pleasure or pain was it in his power to bestow? How much of a good or evil must be done by him? Every idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favorable to his character, and as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself, she thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth, its soft impropriety of expression. When all of the house that was open to the general inspection had been seen, they returned downstairs, and, taking leave of the housekeeper, were consigned over to the gardener, who met them at the hall door. As they walked across the halls towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again. Her uncle and aunt stopped also, and while at the former were conjecturing as to the date of the building, the owner of it suddenly himself came forward from the road which led behind it to the stables. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of both were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly, recovering himself, advanced towards the party, and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. She had instinctively turned away, but stopping on his approach, received his compliments with an embarrassment impossible to be overcome. Had his first appearance, or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining, been insufficient to assure the other two that they now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise on beholding his master must immediately have told it. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face, and knew not what answer she returned to his civil inquiries after her family. Amazed at the altercation of his manner since they last parted, every sentence that he uttered was increasing her embarrassment, and every idea of the propriety of her being found there was reoccurring to her mind. The few minutes in which they continued were some of the most uncomfortable in her life. Nor did he seem much more at ease when he spoke. His accent had none of its usual sedateness, and he repeated his inquiries as to the time of her having left Longbourn, and of her having stayed in Derbyshire, so often and in so hurried a way as plainly spoke the distraction of his thoughts. At length every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly recollected himself and took leave. The others then joined her, and expressed admiration of his figure. But Elizabeth heard not a word, and wholly engrossed by her own feelings, followed them in silence. She was overpowered by shame and vexation. Her coming there was almost the most unfortunate, most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange it must appear to him! What a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man! It might have seemed as if she had thrown herself purposely in his way again. Oh, why did she come? Or why did he thus come a day before he was expected? Had they only been 10 minutes sooner, they should have been beyond the reach of his discrimination, for it was plain that he was that moment arrived, that moment alighted from his horse or his carriage. She blushed over and over again over the perverseness of the meeting, and his behavior so strikingly altered. What could it mean? That he then even speak to her was amazing, but to speak with such civility, to inquire after her family, never in her life had she seen his manner so little dignified, never had he spoken with such a gentleness on this unexpected meeting. What a contrast it did offer, too. His last address at Rossings Park, when he put his letter into her hand, she knew not what to think, or how to account for it. They had now entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water, and every step was bringing forward a nobler fall of ground, or finer reach of the forest to which they were approaching. But it was some time before Elizabeth was sensible to any of it, and though she answered mechanically to the repeated appeals of her uncle and aunt, they seemed to direct her eyes to such objects as they pointed out. She distinguished no part of the scene. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot of Primbley House, whichever it may be, where Mr. Darcy then was. She longed to know what at the moment was passing in his mind, in what manner he thought of her, and whether, in defiance of everything, she was still dear to him. Perhaps he had been civil only because he felt himself at ease, yet there had been that in his voice which was not like ease. Whether he had felt more of pain or pleasure in seeing her, she could not tell, but he certainly had not seen her with composure. At length, however, the remarks of her companions on her absence of mind aroused her, and she felt the necessity of appearing more like herself. They entered the woods, and bidding adieu to the river for a while, ascended some of the higher grounds, when, in spots where the opening of trees gave the eye a power to wander, there were many charming views of the valley, the opposite hills, with the long range of woods overspreading many and occasionally part of the stream. Mr. Gardiner expressed a wish of going around the whole park, but feared it might be beyond a walk. With a triumphant smile, they were told that it was 10 miles round. It settled the matter, and they pursued the accustomed circuit, which brought them again, after some time, in a descent among hanging woods, to the edge of the water and one of its narrowest parts. They crossed it by a simple bridge in a character with the general air of the scene. It was spot less adorned than any they had yet visited, and the valley, here contradicted into a glen, allowed the room only for the stream and a narrow walk amidst the rough coppice wood that bordered it. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but they had crossed the bridge and perceived their distance from the house. Mrs. Gardiner, who was not a great walker, could go no further, and thought of only returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. Her niece was, therefore, obliged to submit, and they took their way towards the house on the opposite side of the river, in the nearest direction. But their progress was slow, for Mr. Gardiner, who seldom able to indulge the taste, was very fond of fishing, and was so much engaged in watching the occasional appearance of some trout in the water and talking to the man about them, that he advanced but little. Whilst wandering on in his slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what had been at first, by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them, and at no greater distance. The walk being here less sheltered than on the other side, allowed them to see him before they met. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, as if he intended to meet them. For a few moments, indeed, she felt that he would probably strike into some other path. The idea lasted a while. Turning in the walk concealed him from their view. The turning past, he was immediately before them. With a glance, she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and, to intimidate his politeness, she began, as they met, to admire the beauty of the place. But she had not got beyond the words delightful and charming, when some unlucky recollections obtruded, and she fancied that praise of Primbley from her might be mysteriously constructed. Her color changed, and she said no more. Mrs. Gardiner was standing a little behind, and on her pausing, he asked her if she would do him the honor of introducing him to her friends. This was a stroke of civility for which she had been quite unprepared, and she could hardly suppress a smile at his being now seeking the acquaintanceship of some of those very people against whom his pride had revolted in his offer to herself. What will be his surprise, thought she, when he knows who they are, and takes them now for people of fashion? The introduction, however, was immediately made, and as she named their relationship to herself, she stole a sly look at him to see how he bore it, and he was not without the expectation of decampment as fast as he could from such disgraceful companions. That he was surprised by the connection was evident, and he sustained it, however, with fortitude, and so far from going away, turned his back with them, and entered into conversation with Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth could not but be pleased, could not but triumph. It was consoling that he should know she had some relations for whom there was no need to blush. She listened most attentively to all that passed between them, and glorified in every expression, every sentence of her uncle, which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. The conversation soon turned to fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite him with the greatest civility to fish there as often as he chose while he continued in the neighborhood, offering at the same time to supply him with fish tackle and pointing out those parts of the stream where there was usually most sport. Mrs. Gardiner, who was walking arm in arm with Elizabeth, gave her a look of expression of wonder. Elizabeth said nothing, but it gratified her exceedingly. The compliment must be all for herself. Her astonishment, however, was extreme, and continuously she was repeating, "Why is he so altered? From what can it proceed? It cannot be for me. It cannot be for my sake, that his manners are thus softened. My reproofs at Hunsford could not work such a change as this. It is impossible that he should still love me." After walking some time in this way, the two ladies in front, the two gentlemen behind, on resuming their places, after descending to the brink of the river for the better inspection of some of the curious water plant, there chanced to be little altercation. It originated in Mrs. Gardiner, who, fatigued by the exercise of the morning, found Elizabeth's arm inadequate to her support, and consequently preferred her husband's. Mr. Darcy took her place by her knees, and they walked on together. After a short silence, the lady first spoke. She wished him to know that they had been assured of his absence before she came to the place, and unaccordingly began by observing that his arrival had been very unexpected. "For your housekeeper," she added, "informed us that you would certainly not be here till tomorrow. And indeed, before we left Bakewell, we understood that you were not immediately expected in the country." He acknowledged the truth of it all, and said that business with the steward had occasioned his coming forward a few hours before the rest of the party with whom he had been traveling. "They will join me early tomorrow," he continued, "and among them there are some who will claim an acquaintance with you, Mr. Bingley and his sisters." Elizabeth answered only by a slight bow. Her thoughts were instantly driven back on the time when Mr. Bingley's name had been the last mentioned between them, and, if she might judge by his complexion, his mind was not very differently engaged. "There is also one other person in the party," he continued after a pause, "who more particularly wishes to be known to you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to your acquaintanceship during your stay at Lambton?" The surprise of such an application was great indeed, and it was too great for her to know in what manner she acceded it. She immediately felt that whatever desire Miss Darcy might have for being acquainted with her must be the work of her brother, and without looking farther, it was satisfactory. It was gratifying to know that his resentment had not made him think ill of her. They now walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Elizabeth was not comfortable, that was impossible, but she was flattered and pleased. His wish of introducing his sister to her was a compliment of the highest kind. They soon outstriped the others, and when they had reached the carriage, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were half a quarter of a mile behind. He then asked her to walk into the house, but she declared herself not tired, and they stood together on the lawn. At such a time, much might have been said, and silence was very awkward. She wanted to talk, but there seemed to be an embargo on every subject. At last she recollected that she had been traveling, and that they had talked of Matlock and Dovedale with the greatest perseverance. Yet time, and her aunt, moved slowly, and her patience and her ideas were nearly worn out before the tete-a-tete was over. On Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's coming up, they were all pressed to go into the house and take some refreshment, but this was declined, and they parted on each side of the utmost politeness. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage, and when it drove off, Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. The observations of her uncle and aunt now began, and each of them pronounced him to be indefinitely superior to anything they had expected. "He is perfectly well behaved, polite, and unassuming," said her uncle. "There is something a little stately in him, to be sure," replied her aunt, "but it is confined to his air, and it is not unbecoming. I can now say with the housekeeper that though some people may call him proud, I have seen nothing of it. I was never more surprised than by his behavior to us. It was more than civil, and it was really attentive, and there was no necessity for such attention. His acquaintanceship with Elizabeth was very trifling. To be sure, Lizzie, said her aunt, he is not so handsome as Wickham, or rather he has not Wickham's countenance, for his features are perfectly good. But how you came to tell me that he was so disagreeable? Elizabeth excused herself as well as she could, and said that she had liked him better than they had met in Kent before, and that she had never seen him so pleasant as this morning. But perhaps he may be a little whimsical in his civilities, replied her uncle. Your great men often are, and therefore I shall not take him at his word. He might change his mind another day, and warn me off his grounds. Elizabeth felt that they had entirely misunderstood his character, but said nothing. From what we have seen of him, continued Mrs. Gardiner, I really should not have thought that he ever could have behaved in so cruel a way by anybody as he has done by poor Wickham. He has not an ill-natured look. On the contrary, there is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one unfavorable idea of his heart. But, to be sure, the good lady who showed us his house did give him a most flaming character. I could hardly help laugh aloud sometimes. But he is a liberal master, I suppose, and that in the eye of a servant comprehends every virtue. Elizabeth here felt herself called on to say something in vindication of his character to Wickham, and therefore gave them to understanding, as in regarded a manner as she could, that by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of a very different construction. In that his character was by no means faulty, nor Wickham so amiable, as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of all the pecuniary transactions in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, but stating it to be such as might be relied on. Mrs. Gardiner was surprised and concerned, but as they were now approaching the scene of her former pleasures, every idea gave away the charm of recollection, and she too was much engaged in pointing out to her husband all the interesting spots and environs to think of anything else. Fatigued as she had been by the morning's walk, they no sooner dined than met and set off again in quest of her former acquaintance. And the evening was spent in the satisfactions of an intercourse renewed after many years' continuance. The occasions of the day were too full of interest to leave Elizabeth much attention for any of these new friends, and she could do nothing but think, and think with wonder of Mr. Darcy's civility, and above all, his wishing her to be acquainted with his sister.